Hello guys, welcome back. You've all been asking for tech house bass sound and processing advice, so we're going to do both. This week is sound. As it turns out, tech house has a lot of different bass sounds, so I've gathered up the most popular. I'm going to show you how I made them, how you can make your own, and things to look out for when using them. Let's go. Okay, so here's the Noizu stroke Maupi bass from last week. Let me take you through some of the guiding principles behind this one. So at the heart of this sound is saw wave. There's actually two here. The second one is optional. I'll explain where that one comes in later. But the main saw wave at the top, that's the important one. Then we have filter. Filter's important. And envelopes also are important. Let's take it one step at a time. Let's take it back to basics. Let's remove the filter. Let's undo the main envelope here. So now we're down to just the raw saw wave bass. First step to getting this kind of punchy bass is your envelope. We need a punchy, spiky envelope shape. We do that by dropping the sustain and then playing around with how long it takes to get there with the decay. Now keep in mind, this is going to depend on the tempo of your track and how busy your bass line is. Let me just draw in some extra notes. You might be able to start to hear why you would need a shorter decay with faster bass lines, so it doesn't merge into one, and each note has a distinct attack. Also, you're going to want to consider note length. That matters too. And note length on the MIDI goes hand in hand with your release. Hopefully you're beginning to hear how everything is affecting everything else. So the line and its note length and its complexity affect the sound, and the sound affects the line. Speaking of envelopes, we have a separate one here which is affecting our filter. Let's reduce that. As is typical, this is a low pass filter, LP, letting the low frequencies pass, so we're getting rid of those highs. And we're going to use a spiky envelope to let some of the high frequencies come through at the beginning of the sound only. Now to keep those bumpy, subtle, groovy vibes, we don't want too many high frequencies in here. We need just enough to get that attack and shape at the beginning, but not call attention to itself too much. To help us even more with that, we can steepen the filter. So it has a steeper slope, lets even less high frequencies through. Now, another thing to bear in mind is this filter cutoff frequency is going to depend on the key of your track. We're all the way down in E here. The original Noizu was one lower in D sharp. The challenge with deep bass lines like this is being able to actually hear the note other than just a sub rumble. So we need just enough coming through. Another thing we can do to help with this is play with filter resonance. That's going to emphasize some of the upper frequencies, helping it cut through a bit. And it gives it a different sound too. So we can dial that in to taste. Again, you might need more or less of that depending on your key and note lengths, etc. You'll start to notice some tracks have the more squelchy sound and some have the more solid sound. So another trick we can do to help it cut is add this second oscillator in at an octave above. We don't usually want to overpower the original one though. We're just going to dial this in subtly. Again, this is to help us cut in lower keys. If you're all the way up in B or C, something like that, you might not need this. Well, hopefully, as you can hear, all the way down here in E, the Ds, D sharps, that kind of thing, it can help a lot. Now, I must warn you about this. If you're making bass sounds with more than one oscillator, you're going to need to be aware of how your synth of choice deals with oscillator phase. Vital, Massive, and I think Serum as well, all by default have random phase on, which means each time the oscillator plays, it plays back from a different start position. It's measured in degrees, like a circle, 360. And the problem is this: when two or more waves interact, certain frequencies in that sound can either add together or subtract from each other. In extreme cases, certain frequencies will cancel each other. And if that's your bass frequencies, you're going to end up with no bass in your bass sound. So we want to make sure random phase is off, and then we can play with the phase relationship. Listen to this. You hear the sound get thinner? That's because one of our middle harmonics is cancelled. So this is all going to be dependent on which waveforms you're adding together, like saws, sines, square waves, etc. So even though we have two saw waves here, one of them is playing a higher pitch, it's an octave up, right? So watch what happens when we change the relationship of the phase. Far more solid that way. So remember that if you're mixing multiple oscillators. If of course it's just one oscillator in the patch, then this doesn't do anything. Make sure you're listening out for any thinning of the sound. You're going to have to tune that one by ear. So the last thing I want to show you is a pitch envelope trick. Now these bass parts are just as much percussion as they are musical. Bass parts on these kind of rhythms are acting almost like a tom part, bumping along. And we can give our bass sound here some of that percussive quality by spiking the pitch just at the beginning very quickly. This envelope here is very quick. Let me zoom out. This is its real length. It's very short compared to the others. I'm going to send this to oscillator pitch. Listen to what happens. We get that little bump at the beginning, like a tom. Let me lengthen the decay so you can hear what it's doing. For those of you who've watched my tuning kicks video, this will look familiar, because what makes a drum sound like it does, or part of it anyway, is this descending pitch. So this pitch spike basically turns our sound into a hybrid of tom and bass. Gives us a nice bit of attack. Okay, let's move on to the next sound. Okay, so following on from Noizu and Mao, this is more Dolla style, like the recent Rhyme Dust track. Speaking of squelchy basses, this is certainly one of those. It's very similar in its setup. We have an envelope controlling a resonant filter. But the devil is in the details. The filter type is very important here, and also the waveform. Because this filter needs to be able to grab certain harmonics, and that waveform needs to have them. This is technically a saw wave. It's taken from another synthesizer though, from the Arturia Brute. This is from a free pack by Echo Soundworks. It's the Core Analog pack. Go and grab it, very useful. So this is the Brute saw. Let me show you what the normal sawtooth sounds like though. Not anywhere near as squelchy, I think you'll agree. So we need the brute saw or similar. And the second biggest ingredient is called a ladder filter. You might have heard this term before. Ladder is the filter design from the old Moog synths. So called because the transistors were laid out like a ladder on the circuit board. It's a very distinct sound which is useful here. Let me show you a more normal type of filter in comparison. As you can hear, nowhere near as squelchy. So here's our filter envelope. The volume envelope is doing nothing, by the way. This is our filter envelope, and it's very much like the Noizu one. We don't want too much. That takes us into acid vibes. Nope, this kind of track is a much more subtle vibe. We just need enough to get that bump. Also, here's a neat little trick to play with. I have some of the envelope sent to the amount of resonance. So we can try some more resonance at the start. Or less at the start and more at the end. It's another way of getting different character out of the filter. And some might argue a little bit more analog as well, as some filters don't have the same amount of resonance for every frequency. Obviously, key dependent again, you're going to be adjusting this filter frequency depending on what key your track is in, because this squelch needs to catch certain harmonics, and those are going to change with key. Okay, I think that covers everything for this sound. Let's move on. I couldn't resist making this one. This is the Michael Bibi and Knau track Different Side, featuring audio bullies. You'll be glad to know this is a pretty simple one. Again, Echo Soundworks to the rescue with their free analog pack. We're using the square wave from an ARP synthesizer. I presume that means the old ARP 2600, classic 70s synth. It's not a very pure square wave, and that's working to our advantage. It's got some of that resonance that we need up here, which sounds a little bit like FM. If you've ever done FM synthesis with two sine waves octaves apart, it feels like it's got that going on inside it. But it's still got that solid square wave underneath. Without the filter, it's sounding like this. But again, as with a lot of tech house, we need it subtler than that, so we're using the filter. Just a normal filter this time, not the ladder. This time the ladder's got the opposite problem. This filter's not helping us with that upper resonance that gives the sound its character. So we're using just a straight analog filter from Vital right now. And the envelope is looking like that. Nice and quick. Again, using that to give us a little bit of attack. Also, I'm sending a little bit of that envelope to the distortion amount. So our soft clipper here is spiking as well. And into the soft clipper, you'll notice above I've added an EQ, but the EQ is tracking the second harmonic of our waveform here. great things about Vital. It let me move that EQ bump with the different pitches on the keyboard. So no matter what pitch you play, it always gets the right harmonic. It's not a static EQ. All those together get us really close to the sound from different side. Okay, next. Okay, on to some Chris Lake vibes. I'm sure you recognize the line. It's from Begging, his latest release. So what we've got here is basically an 808, isn't it? Sounds like a modern 808. Now, I know what you're going to ask. Why would you synthesize an 808 as opposed to just using a sample? Well, it's the same reasoning for all synth versus samples. It's about control. It's not going to get shorter as it gets higher, and it won't get thinner as it gets higher either. If you didn't know, using samples for bass is pretty risky if you want good bottom end, because pitch shifting a sample actually changes its quality. It messes with the harmonic relationship inside the sound, something called formants. Sounds that don't pitch around a lot, you can get away with it, but not here. As you can hear, the bass line is jumping around a lot. It's jumping quite a few octaves. This bass line is actually an arpeggio. It's an arpeggio of a chord progression. So better to use a synth here. It's in G sharp minor, but the starting chord is D sharp, so it's very low down there, D sharp. Anyway, let me show you what's going on with the synth patch. We start with a sine wave, but this sine wave has a little trick up its sleeve. This sine wave wavetable can morph into a square wave. So what we've done here is send the envelope to the wave shape. So at the beginning of the hit, it's a square wave and it morphs into a sine. Just on this tiny envelope spike here. This is essentially like clipping the beginning of the sound, part of where this distortion is coming from. If you didn't know, in the digital domain, sounds that clip turn into square waves. So it's acting like distortion, but it's also acting like that envelope filter on the other sounds, in the sense that we're getting more high frequencies at the beginning and less at the end, because square waves have a lot more higher frequencies than sines. Speaking of higher frequencies, I have this other sine wave above it so we can blend in. It's not a pure sine, it's got extra harmonics, and that's helping us distinguish the pitch at lower frequencies when we go into lower keys, lower notes. Listen to that low D when we don't have this waveform. Now, release is pretty important on 808s. Listen to this. Changes the groove completely. That's all from just changing the release envelope on the main volume there. So that's release. We've got some harmonics in there. And the last ingredient is the pitch bump. That same idea we discussed earlier with the other sounds. That's also here because 808 is a drum after all, so we need that pitch bump like a drum. Let me emphasize that so you can hear what's going on. Changing the pitch at the beginning. Just very quickly for our little spike. Also important is more distortion. We've actually got two more types of distortion here. Not only was the square wave a type of distortion, but now we have the filter drive. That's acting as one. And the soft clipper. You can hear the difference there. Giving us even more upper harmonics, and more importantly those modern 808 vibes. Speaking of 808s, that brings us neatly on to very similar vibes here from the new Fred Again and Fortet track. This is basically the same patch, but we're distorting a bit more on the soft clipper, and the envelope is a bit longer on that square wave to sine wave transition. That's basically the only difference, apart from the bass line itself, which is spending more time in the higher notes. G. And is shifting the whole octave there. Scale is G Frisian. Of course it is. All of these have been Frisian so far, in fact, apart from Chris Lake. The Noizu were Maupi, they were Frisian. Dolla, the Michael Bibi, all Frisian. Let me mute the ARP, sorry, so you can hear the bass. I just put that there so you recognise the track easier. Anyways, next. Okay, anyone fancy a biscuit? This is supposed to sound like Biscuit's last track, Don't Stop. What style would you call this? I'm hearing a lot of it at the moment, with that kind of percussive lead sound driving the top rhythm, contrasted with something low and slow. Maybe we should call it bong and bump. This being the bong, and this is the bump. Let's mute the lead. So this groove is mostly being carried by this kind of sub-tom pattern here. You could get this with any toms, really, as long as they're short enough. You could put a low-pass filter on them and just also make sure they're not interfering with the kick. I've just got an audio sample. Let us look at the bass. We're just playing some long notes on a low C. Frisian again, of course. I sometimes call this a bow bass. Bow. So how do we make one? This time we're starting with a triangle wave, but that wave itself isn't playing back. All the magic is coming from this sine wave, and we're using FM synthesis. Let me undo this setting, let me bypass this. We have a pure sine wave, you'll probably barely be able to hear this. What we do is we use FM synthesis to effectively multiply that triangle into our sine wave, and that's what's creating this vibe. You can hear that's giving us some upper harmonics. So to get that bow sweep, we're going to use an envelope to change both the FM, the frequency modulation, and the filter, which has got some resonance on it. Like that. So the filter is both helping us keep it subtle, stopping it get too bright, but it's also emphasizing the resonance of that sweep. Okay, on to the last one. Okay, now, I'm sure some of you don't class this track as tech house, but I have been told every man and his dog is playing it right now, so I thought I would include it. This is Meduza's remix of Genesi, Everything You Have Done. Now, what you see on screen before you is mostly guesswork. These kind of sounds are not based on your traditional saws, sines and squares, which at this point are very easy for me to hear. No, when it comes to much more complex sounds like this, they are much harder to reverse engineer and figure out what's going on underneath. There's no magic here, it's just trying lots of waveforms that don't look like saws, sines and squares and seeing if they sound close. So here's my attempt. Having said all that, I did start with a saw wave, as you can see here. I thought that sounded like the kind of fundamentals underneath. Always a good starting point anyway. Let me turn other things off so you can hear the raw waveforms. As you can see, we also have EQ, filter and clipping. So we've got the solid foundation from the saw. Then I got most of the rest of the way there with the second waveform, this more complex waveform, which I found amongst the Serum wavetables. And that got me pretty close to the same kind of growl as the Meduza sound. The first filter job was to take away those super high frequencies. Those extra fizzy high frequencies can really get in the way of hi-hat groove, and hi-hat groove is very important on this track. The second filter is called a notch filter, because I could hear that was happening in the original. Kind of scoops the mid frequencies dynamically. As you can see, it's tracking the pitch. There's no envelope trickery going on here, just our main volume envelope. It's not actually doing that much. It's mostly about balancing the release. So the notes are distinct. And then in the effects chain, we've got a little EQ bump for warmth. So I've added a third filter. This is tracking this resonance here. Basically the same trick I did with the EQ on the Bibi sound. And then we're using the hard clip. That gives us the last bit of grit. And of course, not to forget, heavy use of the glide function. So we slide between notes. There's a little bit more post-processing on this one compared to the others, but nothing essential. I will go over that in the next video. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Don't forget to show me some love by pressing one of the buttons below. You can also buy me a coffee using the link in the description. As always, there will also be links to all these patches down there. If you don't have Vital, it's free. Go and grab it. For anyone struggling to load the patches, try version 1.53. And until I think of a sign-off slogan, I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.